Hey, normally this is the part where I'd play the thing saying, give me money, give me money, give me money, but instead, for the next little while, there's going to be some charities down in the description for some really important stuff. Give them money instead, okay? Thank you. On with the show. I didn't have the same media diet growing up that most kids had. And don't worry, this isn't going to be me doing the whole, my favorite shows were probably shows that you've never heard of. Now, chances are you did hear about them and then forgot about them just as quickly. And looking through the list and seeing the noticeable absences from other people my age and the exact assortment of shows that were actually here really sheds a light on why I have the opinions about cartoons these days that I do. So for a little bit of fun, I took 20 shows I watched as a kid and ranked them from objective worst to objective best. This is different from just a favorite and least favorite. My absolute favorite show is only number 6 on this list, not number 1. And if you don't see your favorite show on this list, that just means I didn't watch it before I turned 16. So let's take a deep dive into my head and create a roadmap for my future psychiatrists. Number 20, Delilah and Julius. I'm not entirely sure why I watched this show as much as I did, if I'm being honest. I don't want to trash on any of these shows, but Delilah and Julius is really bad. Like, the writing is just as bad as the animation sometimes, and I'm not entirely convinced that it wasn't just a hastily rushed together cash grab to try and leech off the popularity of Kim Possible. The characters even look really similar, actually, I'm not gonna lie. It's pretty much your straightforward secret agent show between two characters who have been close to each other for years and who frequently compromise missions with their bias toward one another, and a series-long romantic tension that takes way too long to get caught. Wow, I wasn't off the mark, was I? This is just straight up plagiarism. If I had a nickel for every time Cartoon Network gave a Newgrounds animator way too much of a budget, and then they realized they can't actually write, so they just plagiarize the shows they were watching at the time, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Despite the fact that this show is honestly kind of crap, I do actually have a favorite episode. It's the one where Julius confesses his feelings to Delilah, only to get his memory of doing so erased while they're stuck on a desert island. And then at the end of the episode, he remembers he did that and does it again, and then he gets his memory erased again. I gave Starversus and She-Ra a lot of crap for their aggressive ship teasing. At least they didn't have their love confession get erased by amnesia twice in the same episode. Number 19, Card Captors. Man, I didn't really want to be mean today, but Card Captors is another show that just did not age well, and I was watching the Canadian localization, which is actually the best version of the show, and it's still not that good. It's hard to salvage any work that's based off a creepy comic book from Japan that thought, among other things, that stalking was romantic, and that a 4th grader being in a relationship with her adult teacher was totally acceptable, and the original run of the show wasn't much better. When Nelvana got their hands on it, they pretty much gutted most of its content to turn it into a Saturday morning cartoon, and I'll be honest, it kind of worked. It is basically cobbled together as best it can be, and while it hasn't aged well, it's good enough for what the localization team had to work with in the first place. There's a limit to what Nelvana could have done, which is why all of Sakura's weird-ass costume still made it into the show. I would never willingly watch it again, but I liked it enough to want to see it to the end at least, even if I never did figure out what the Hope card was supposed to be. Anyway, my favorite episode of Card Captors is the one where they spend an entire 30 minutes just chasing the Dash card for no reason whatsoever. Number 18, Monster by Mistake. So a kid gets cursed by a spellbook and a magic gem when a little gremlin in a glass ball tricks him into reading out the spell, and now every time he sneezes, he turns into some giant blue grimace-looking motherfucker. And I'm pretty sure this show was made on drugs. Like, this is the kind of show stoners would watch when they're high, and that's probably the only way to truly understand what's going on. It was a fun and enjoyable show to an extent, and I think it really highlights the sheer novelty a lot of these shows are running on, which will become a little more apparent as we go down to the list. The 2000s were big on novelty above everything else. Number 17, Teen Titans. Oh hey look, sometimes I actually watched a show that the other kids were watching. It's crazy, isn't it? See, when I was a kid, I had a nasty habit of catching one episode of a show offhandedly and just going, oh okay, I guess I'm watching this now, which is how I started watching most of the shows on this list, if I'm being honest. And Teen Titans was no different because my sister was watching it one day and I just sat down and let my ADHD bitch ass do the rest. I never had the delusions about Teen Titans that most other people did. Like, it's common to see it highlighted as a deep and meaningful and serious cartoon, but that was never what Teen Titans was. It was a comedy at the end of the day. They spent half the time having wacky hijinks and the other half looking like a cross between Hello Kitty and Pokemon. These days, Teen Titans is remembered less for its content and more for the insufferably bitchy attitude of its fan base. When a new Teen Titans show came out that wasn't super ethereal, it was a fun show. It wasn't a milestone. Calm down. My favorite episode is the one where Starfire gets her sister arrested. Number 16, Recess. School really is a prison, isn't it? Someone at Disney clearly thought so because they made a show that characterizes school like a prison and the titular recess like a prison yard. It's kind of a loose parody, but they did have one episode about solitary confinement. A lot of these shows are difficult to talk about without the context of having been a kid when these shows were coming on and seeing everything you hated about school being validated and torn apart. Like, remember when the ultimate power fantasy was being able to sass authority figures and get away with it? Fuck, I'm old. My favorite episode is the one where TJ goes insane and Age regresses into a kindergartner. Number 15, Mummies Alive. See, I didn't watch Power Rangers or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles growing up. I watched this shit, which for some reason was allowed to exist. Mummies Alive is a show about 4 mummies who rose from the dead to protect either the descendant or reincarnation of an ancient pharaoh. I don't remember which. And that's it. It's basically Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but they're all dead. It was a pretty enjoyable show, even if I didn't completely understand what the fuck was going on. But revisiting it, it's really weird the way this show kind of pervs on Nefertina. You know, if I had a nickel for every time someone tried to make a rotting corpse be sexually appealing, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Number 14, Pokemon. Good lord, this one's gonna date me, isn't it? I started watching Pokemon during the first season, way back when there were only 150 Pokemon. And just like the games, I overwhelmingly preferred the Hoenn arc over the Kanto arc. And you wanna know something? I've never found another person whose favorite generation is different from the first they played or watched. Crazy, huh? Pokemon's been a difficult show to talk about in broad strokes because it's been on for so long that each region effectively is an entirely different show with entirely new characters. But I found something to like in almost every series, even if I haven't regularly kept up with it since Kalos. But I've always liked how this show kept true to the spirit of the Gen 1 games and was about Ash's personal journey over everything else. Yeah, sure, those shitty teams from every single generation pop up all the time to cause trouble, but that's not what you're there for, in the same way you don't go to the beach to get sand kicked in your face. Ash is one of my favorite protagonists. I know a lot of people grumble and whine about his effective reset every generation, but I don't mind it, as each generation of the show is meant to be aimed to a new generation of kids, and so not expecting them to watch every episode of a 20-year-long show is only a good thing. I always thought of the generation shift as effectively being a soft reboot rather than one long continuity. I don't have a lot of time for each show, so I'll just single out May and Iris as my favorite companions for Ash on his journey. I find they brought most of the unique additions to the group, with Dawn and Serena really just being half-baked clones of May and Misty being somewhere in the middle. My favorite episodes of this show are The Bonds of Evolution and Do I Hear a Waltz? The former because we see a banshee kicking ass, and the latter because she's got a babu in it. Number 13, Fairly Odd Parents. Okay, getting this out of the way. Butch Hartman is a talentless cultural pollutant who piggybacked off the skills of others to make exactly 2 shows of note and hasn't contributed anything of value to the world since. Okay? Okay, good, okay. Now, Fairly Odd Parents cemented my love of absurdist humor. Nothing in this show makes sense because you have omnipotent fairies granting wishes at the behest of a 10-year-old with a permanent sugar high. So nothing makes sense, everything is wacky nonsense, and you must be this high to ride. It was a lot like SpongeBob in the vein of not really having much of a story and just being a wild ride of a show hidden inside the skin of a slice of life comedy. It lasted for over 10 years for a reason, because as much as adult cartoon fans these days want to pretend otherwise, this shit was just more fun than melodrama. My favorite episode of this show is the one where Timmy gets turned into a girl. Number 12, Chalk Zone. You remember what I said about the 2000s being all about novelty? The entire premise behind Chalk Zone is that a magic chalk can open a portal to an alternate dimension where everything is made of chalk and all the inhabitants are chalk drawings who were erased from chalkboards and sidewalks in the real world. And once they're in Chalk Zone, literally anything that's drawn becomes real and comes to life. And that's it. That's the show. What imaginative nonsense can Rudy come up with to literally Photoshop his way out of trouble this week? Sit back and enjoy a half hour of literally every single solitary brain fart the art team came up with during their lunch break. Number 11, The Clone Wars. I don't need to talk about The Clone Wars. You already know The Clone Wars. You all petitioned for the last season of The Clone Wars to actually be made because you just couldn't let an ambiguous ending exist and needed more maul shoved down your throat. Clone Wars didn't become mega popular until about the 3rd season when it started making superficially dark storylines, but I liked Clone Wars right from the start. Ahsoka was even my favorite new character before Disney completely forced her into every single possible story they could because they don't know the meaning of restraint, and now whenever I see her announced to appear in anything else, I just groan and roll my eyes. It was always a surprisingly high quality show. Every returning character from the prequels had voice acting that tried really hard to replicate their movie counterparts, except Anakin for some reason. But then again, this was 2008, a time when people were still pretending that Hayden Christensen was the worst thing to happen to Star Wars. Actually, shit, they're still doing that. People are still deluding themselves into thinking Kylo Ren was a more fleshed out character than Anakin. Fuck, I hate Star Wars fans. Anyway, my favorite episode of Clone Wars is the one where they do brain surgery and a clone trooper gets high on hallucinogenics. Number 10, Hamtaro. Yeah, talk about weird entries, huh? I think I mentioned Hamtaro all of once on my channel, despite watching it a lot as a kid, but the number 1 on this list has never been talked about on my channel, despite the fact that I obsessed over it so much as a kid that it inadvertently influenced the path of my life to be exactly where I am right now. Yeah, talk about origin stories. Hamtaro is the only good non-Pokemon Japanese cartoon. It's about fluffy little hamsters going on adventures and being friends, and no other bullshit. Like, off they go on an adventure. Number 9, 16. Yeah, so Total Drama is really popular with people, but it was the predecessor series 16 that I always liked better. 16 is a straightforward sitcom that deals with typical teenage bullshit. Part-time jobs, tests, dating, having to suffer working in retail, that time you accidentally flashed an entire club, the zombie apocalypse, using a disguise to keep giving blood for free donuts until you almost exsanguinate yourself. I gotta say, if I had a nickel for every time a kid in a cartoon almost died of blood loss just because he wanted a few free donuts, I'd have a nickel. 16 had probably one of the most unique and interesting sets of characters, and it works kind of like Friends when you think about it, only it's more palatable to teenagers. In the early 2000s, there was an explosion of teen issue shows like Degrassi, but they usually very quickly turned into fucking soap operas, so they're always caked in melodrama, because, you know, nothing spells relevant to teenagers like a fucking gonorrhea outbreak. 16 was a comedy and kept things light and relevant. My favorite episode is the one where Nikki gets a crush on the new girl who works at the khaki barn. Number 8, Lilo and Stitch the series. Look at all the adorable little monsters getting jobs. That's it, that's all I got. Number 7, Metabots. You know how Pokemon would just give 10-year-olds violent, destructive creatures and be like, okay, don't cause the apocalypse? Well, Metabots did the same thing, only instead of animals with rows and rows and rows of sharp teeth and violent territorial tendencies, it was robots that have machine guns and rocket launchers. Happy birthday, Icky, here's a literal artillery weapon. Metabots had the single most enjoyable character in Metabee, a hot-tempered, arrogant robot who sassed Icky like it was nobody's business and was his own Metabot. You know, kind of like what Pearl tried to be and failed. And frankly, the show was carried by Metabee and all his wacky antics. Like, you can skip anything that isn't Icky and Metabee bickering and not lose anything of value. My favorite episode is the one where Metabee yells at Icky, which is every episode. Number 6, Dave the Barbarian. I'm just gonna play this clip for you.
Thinking quickly, Dave constructs a homemade megaphone using only some string, a squirrel, and a megaphone.
Are we all clear? Number 5, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Let's face it, y'all knew it was going to be somewhere. There's no statement more universally agreed upon than Avatar is good. New cartoons are always being compared to Avatar like it's the Dark Souls of cartoon comparison, and its legacy is one so massive that it has officially become poisoned by its own influence and buried under the weight of 1,000 shovelware copycats. Objectively, Avatar is a very good cartoon, one of the best even, and it deserves much of the praise it gets. The only praise it doesn't deserve is in how it handles Zuko's redemption arc, because Zuko doesn't actually get a redemption. Zuko is an abuse victim finding escape from his abuser, and as we've established before, victims of abuse do not need to change. Don't call Zuko's story a redemption arc 2020. Objectively, Avatar is great. Subjectively, I hope I never have to hear so much as a whisper of its name for the rest of my life. I loved this show as a kid, and I stand by its status as a groundbreaking show. It's not the best cartoon ever made, we're 4 slots away from that, but it is still very good. But I resent it for what it represents and the damage it has inflicted upon the industry as 1,000 copycats stink up the place and bury the talented efforts of actually good creators under their jackboot. And rest assured, my resentment has not affected its position on this list. I would have put it at number 5 even without the resentment because other shows are just better. Number 4, Rugrats. There's something to be said about exploring the world through the mind of a 1-year-old, namely in that everything is so down to the ground that it's hard for Rugrats to collapse in on itself. Rugrats was a very enjoyable sitcom that, while it never really had a cohesive theme to it, nonetheless managed to pull out all the stops and deliver a very heartfelt and earnest show. Lest we forget the second movie where Chucky is lamenting the fact that he doesn't have a mother, and you watch this small child deal with grief he didn't know he had. Actually, you know, between this and the number 1 on this list, that's 2 instances now of the second film in a series taking a lovable redhead and absolutely sucker punching them a dozen times for maximum crying. If I had a nickel, blah blah blah. My favorite episode of Rugrats is the aforementioned Rugrats in Paris. Let Chucky be happy, damn it. Number 3, Fillmore. Did you know Disney made a detective show that parodied crime dramas back in the day? It makes sense that you wouldn't know that since it isn't on Disney Plus for some reason. Let me set the stage for you, okay? This is the first episode of Fillmore. Ex-middle school is rolling out new bathroom stalls, which then get tagged by a graffiti artist known as Stainless. In trying to determine who was behind the tagging, they talked to a previously notorious tagger who was so bad that when they finally caught him, he was sealed up in quarantine to do distance learning like it's 2020. And his whole bit is an extended Hannibal Lecter parody. No, really. Then they finally do catch Stainless, but it turns out to be a girl who was really creepily into bathroom stalls, like it's her extracurricular activity or something, and she was upset that Principal Folsom, who was voiced by Ida the Owl Lady, by the way, didn't use a very particular kind of steel that she wanted, and that's the show.
Every episode is a new middle school level crime that's based loosely on a real world crime, and the culprit is usually some weirdo who is way too attached to some element of the school. Like the Girl Scouts, who are practically the freaking mafia, and Ingrid goes undercover to bust their operations. Seriously, the show is a trip and you need to see it. My favorite episode is the one with the son of a diplomat who has diplomatic immunity so they can't bust his counterfeit card operation until they just decide, fuck it, and bust him anyway. Number 2, The Weekenders. The Weekenders is just a freaking treat. It's a really low-energy kind of sitcom about 4 friends navigating the existential dread of being known, and then getting life lessons from Tino's mom over her latest freaky dish of the week. Or over at the pizza place that is constantly changing themes like it's made by Scott Cawthon or something. With a lot of these shows, and The Weekenders in particular, slice of life really is the order of the day, so there isn't really a whole lot to say about the story because, well, there isn't one. That's just how shows were made. In the 2000s, we had your classic Saturday morning cartoons, slice of life shows, and novelty shows like Fillmore and the number one we're about to get to. My favorite episode of The Weekenders is the one where Tino says he has no emotions and Lore describes him as a fire hydrant with legs. Number 1, Kim Possible. You know, I almost forgot how much I loved this show. Like, for real, ever since I stopped watching it after it ended, it kind of slipped my mind completely, which is strange considering I was so obsessed with it as a little baby gay that it was what pushed me into fandom culture and indirectly led me to the job I'm doing right now. That's a lot of influence to just completely forget about, but you can thank I Love Kim Possible a lot for being a walking billboard that made me go, oh hey, me too, I should check that out again. And I'll tell you what, it deserves to be called the best show ever made. It was a densely packed show that managed to juggle 2 separate threads at the same time and make them both compelling. Kim is a heroine who can save the world like it's no big deal, so much so that she barely even thinks about it, but who in her home life falls extremely easily to peer pressure and insecurities about status and high school caste systems. Kim has a 3-season long arc about learning to be comfortable with herself and not let malicious actors erode her self-confidence, which she ceases to fall prey to in the final season after Draken preys on those vulnerabilities to gaslight her so badly that she actually considers giving up. Seriously, this character's really fucking cool, I love her. And for a goofy take on spy movies, this show has some of the best humor I've ever seen. It was like the writing team was just hitting it out of the park every single week, giving it their all and making something that was genuinely high quality while simultaneously keeping itself grounded. A lesser cartoon would have spent way too much time on the super science, but Kim Possible doesn't. It gets right to the things that make a good show, namely the character work between the main protagonists and the large array of colorful antagonists. And honestly, one of the most unfailingly adorable relationships ever put on screen, and proof positive that couples being in a relationship while the show is still going is still the gold standard we desperately need to have. God, I could just gush about this show for hours and hours if I really wanted to. And you know what? I just might.
Reach me.